All right, so up until this point, we've talked about how to train each muscle individually. Now it's time to put it all together, so today I'm going to teach you guys how to create your own comprehensive muscle growth training program. Before we get to that though, we first need to talk about the foundational principles of exercise science that inform our programming decisions. These principles include specificity, overload, progression, recuperation, and reversibility. We will also cover variation and individualization, and while they're not technically foundational concepts in exercise science, I do believe they need to be covered in order to facilitate an in-depth understanding of exercise training. But let's get started with the most important stuff and go over specificity first. This is arguably the most important principle in exercise training, regardless of the adaptation a trainee desires. An adaptation is a measurable physiological change that occurs as a result of exercise, like muscle strength, muscle size, cardiorespiratory endurance, flexibility, speed, power, and balance, just to name a few. The principle of specificity tells us that the body only adapts to the demands that we impose on it. Simply put, marathon runners do not train like powerlifters, and powerlifters do not train like marathon runners. The attributes that make each of these athletes successful in their respective sport are completely different. Therefore, their training protocols are very different from one another. So when designing your own training program, you need to make sure it caters to what you are actually trying to accomplish. The next principle of exercise training is called overload. The concept of overload tells us that any given training session must be difficult enough in relation to an individual's maximal performance to warrant adaptation of the target tissue. For example, in flexibility training, the stretch must be far enough in order to induce flexibility gains over time. For balance training, the environment must be unstable enough in order to improve balance. In strength training, an individual must be lifting a weight that is close enough to their 1 rep max to improve strength. It is important to consider that the key phrase in my definition is difficult enough. This means that your training must cross a threshold of difficulty that we call the overload threshold. The overload threshold is the beginning of something called the effective stimulus range. The effective stimulus range is a difficulty range that is hard enough to stimulate adaptations, but not hard enough to cause overtraining, burnout, or injury in the short term. It is only by training within the effective stimulus range that you will be able to create changes in your body. Training within this range for too long, however, can cause some very unpleasant side effects that we want to avoid, which we will talk about more in a little bit. The next principle is called progression. This states that the workload must increase over time as an individual's abilities improve. The relative difficulty of any given task in the gym will decrease as an individual adapts to training. Because of this, things that were once difficult will eventually fall below the overload threshold and thus no longer stimulate adaptations. Let's take a look at an example to help contextualize this. Say you want to grow your biceps. You curl a 60-pound barbell for 3 sets of 10 reps. Let's assume that that amount of work surpasses the overload threshold for you. You will be able to grow muscle using that same 60 pounds for 3 sets of 10 for a while, depending on how far above the overload threshold it is. However, as time goes on and your biceps grow, curling 60 pounds for 3 sets of 10 will no longer be challenging for you. Thus, significant growth in your biceps cannot be expected to be stimulated through a session consisting of this workload. This is the rationale for progressive overload and exercise training. I want to clarify something about progressive overload though, because I think a lot of people get confused about it. People think that you need to continually progress your performance in the gym because it is a causative factor for muscle gain, but in fact it's the other way around. You gained muscle and therefore you need to progress. So if your performance does not improve in the gym, that is an indication that something is wrong with your program. The next principle is recuperation. Some people may also refer to this as recovery or fatigue management, and it is a crucial part of creating a good exercise program. As I mentioned in the overload section, training above the overload threshold for an extended duration of time can cause some very unpleasant side effects like general fatigue, tiredness, sleep disruption, decreased strength, mood disturbances, and inability to recover between sets in the gym. This is commonly referred to as overtraining. However, crossing the overload threshold is a necessary part of exercise training if we want to stimulate adaptations and thus achieve your goals. Therefore, we must implement fatigue management strategies to help mitigate these side effects, facilitating continual progress in the long term. Here are some common strategies that you can use to help with recovery. Get a sufficient duration and quality of sleep, which is usually about 7 to 9 hours for most people. Engage in fun, non-gym related activities, and do things that help you relax, whatever that may be for you as an individual. You can also implement something called periodization in your training. While sleep is by far the most important of these things that I just mentioned, periodization definitely comes in second place. Periodization is simply a way of structuring your training, and it will implement something called a deload. A deload is a period of very easy training that can last anywhere between 4 days and 1 week. Its purpose is to get rid of any systemic fatigue that you've accumulated over the course of your training block, while simultaneously keeping the adaptations that you've gained. Again, it is intended to be easy, so do not push yourself even remotely hard during this time. This will facilitate the recovery and healing that is necessary to set you up for another successful block of training. I will mention that deloading should only be reserved for people who are legitimately training to all-out muscular failure, so if you're someone who isn't training that hard, this doesn't really apply to you. The last principle of exercise science is reversibility, aka use it or lose it. This principle simply states that if you do not utilize the abilities that you have gained from training, then you will regress. There is no incentive for your body to keep the training adaptations when there is no potent stimulus being presented. It should be noted, however, that it requires much less effort to maintain an adaptation or to regain a lost adaptation than it does to gain it in the first place. This is something that many people refer to as muscle memory. I find this term to be a bit of a misnomer, considering that skeletal muscles and nerve fibers are two distinct entities, and muscles themselves have no memory. But if you find this term to be beneficial to your understanding of the principle of reversibility, then by all means continue using it. Now let's talk about variation. You may have heard Arnold Schwarzenegger say that you need to confuse the muscle to cause growth. As much as I love Arnold, he is certainly incorrect about this. However, he is not completely wrong. Up until this point, we have discussed your training needs to be specific to your desired adaptation, difficult enough to warrant those adaptations, progressive in nature to keep up with your changing body, and periodized to account for cumulative fatigue. Ideally, we would select 1 or 2 exercises for each body part, implement these principles, and you'd get to your goals in no time. This, unfortunately, is not how things go in real life. As you continue to use the same exercise variations over and over, they begin to become stale. Exercise staleness is characterized by a number of symptoms, including the following: plateaus in performance not attributable to an outside source or life stressor, decreased perception of tension in the target muscle, decreased or lack of pump, decreased or lack of local fatigue/tiredness in the target muscle directly following a set, decreased or lack of delayed onset muscle soreness, decreased desire to train, and perception of stress in the joints rather than the muscles. If most or all of these symptoms are present, then it is likely that the exercise variation that you are using is stale. An exercise that is stale must be swapped out for a similar exercise that targets the same musculature to facilitate continual progress. Your program should only be changed as much as is necessary to account for exercise staleness, so no, changing the exercises that you're doing on a session-to-session basis is not a good idea. Depending on the movement pattern and the individual trainee, exercises usually remain fresh anywhere from 4 weeks to multiple years. Keeping exercises the same for an extended duration of time ensures that we can keep track of your performance, allowing us to implement overload and progression effectively in your program. Your performance also gives you feedback about whether or not the strategies that you're using are actually working. Based upon this, you can make changes where they are necessary. Moving on to individualization. Individuals may respond to exercise training in different ways. As is the case with many things, people's physiological responses to exercise exist on a normal distribution or bell curve. Though the majority of people respond in the same way, there are always outliers and individual variants throughout the population. This highlights the importance of experimentation in an exercise program. Though science gives us very good general recommendations, they should act merely as starting points. For many people, these starting points will work near optimally and will not need to be changed. However, others may find that what is optimal for them strays very far from evidence-based recommendations. This is why we cannot be overly dogmatic about the evidence gathered from scientific studies relating to exercise adaptations. Though I think it is useful to use studies as the most significant form of evidence, there are 2 additional tiers of evidence that can inform training and nutrition decisions. These tiers are personal experience and the experience of others, with personal experience being the more significant of the 2. When you're figuring out what works best for you as an individual, you need to design experiments to perform on yourself. What I mean by that is that you need to hold different aspects of your life constant while changing a variable of interest to see how it affects your results. This is the only way that you will truly be able to establish a causative relationship between two things, and it is what scientists do whenever they run an experiment. By performing an experiment on yourself and using yourself as the control, you correct for all the confounding variables that might be present in the lives of the people who participate in exercise studies. Let me give you a quick and oversimplified example to help you understand what I mean by all of this. Let's say we're working with 4 major variables: training, nutrition, sleep, and stress. The only way to figure out if one training method is superior to another is to keep nutrition, sleep, and stress constant and to test each training method for some duration of time. This way, when you compare the results of each training method, you can say with certainty that any difference you observe is not due to nutrition, sleep, or stress because they were all held constant throughout the duration of your experiment. This is the essence of the scientific method. While experimenting on yourself isn't entirely scientific, considering that the population size you're working with is only one person, it is pertinent to figuring out how you can best achieve results. So use the recommendations established by science as a starting point, then do experiments of your own to dial in your training from there. Now that we've covered the basic principles of exercise science, it's time that we understand how these concepts translate to our actual training. This brings us to a concept known as stimulus recovery adaptation, or SRA for short. SRA applies to every type of exercise training, regardless of which adaptation you are trying to elicit. It goes something like this. First, you stimulate by presenting an overloading stimulus specific to the adaptation you are trying to gain. Then, you recover from that stimulus by refraining from presenting another stimulus for some duration of time. During this time, the various structures involved in training begin to heal and recover, like connective tissues, joints, ligaments, tendons, muscles, and nerve fibers. Then you adapt. After the recovery process is complete, the body increases its abilities beyond its baseline in accordance with the stimulus that was presented. Let's look at hypertrophy training as a specific example. The stimulus is mechanical tension in the target muscles. When you recover, you repair the muscles, motor neurons, tendons, and ligaments that were involved in the session. Finally, the muscles that you trained adapt by growing to a larger size than their baseline. This idea is important because it emphasizes the fact that adaptations can only occur after recovery. If the stimulus we present is too potent, then all of our resources will be expended for recovery purposes. Thus, there will be nothing left over to facilitate adaptations, which is the reason we are even training in the first place. As the great 8-time Mr. Olympia winner Lee Haney once said, stimulate, don't annihilate. So now that you have all of the theoretical knowledge about how to create exercise programs, let's dive into specifics about how to apply this knowledge practically so you can create your very own muscle growth training program. Let's start by creating a training split. This divides the work that you do in the gym over the course of a week into different training days. You may have heard of many popular training splits like push-pull legs, upper-lower, the bro split, and many others. While all of these splits can work quite well, I want to make something clear to you guys. There is no best training split. There are only 3 major purposes that a training split serves, and as long as your split fulfills them, it really doesn't matter how you divide everything up. The first purpose of a training split is to make sure you can do enough sets for each muscle group on a weekly basis. The second purpose is to make sure that each set is of sufficient quality, aka each set is actually close to your maximal performance. The third purpose is to make sure you give a muscle 48 to 72 hours to recover before training it again. As long as your training split follows these rules, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. You can group any muscle together that you'd like. Just because it's popular to train certain muscles like chest and triceps together doesn't mean you have to do that. You can get results that are just as good by training them on separate days. So my recommendation to you is to choose the split that you enjoy the most and that will get you enthusiastic about training. Just keep in mind the 3 points I mentioned earlier. Now let's move on to the next important point of creating a program: volume and frequency. Volume is defined as sets times reps times load, but typically in hypertrophy training, we just define it as the number of hard sets performed per week, since reps and load are inversely proportional when training close to failure. Here are some general recommendations for volume and frequency for different muscle groups. One important thing to keep in mind is that some muscles recover more quickly than others, so they can be trained more frequently with higher volume. Some muscle groups are also best trained with movements that cause high amounts of systemic fatigue, so they cannot be trained as frequently. Overall, these recommendations are very general and can be subject to variation depending upon the individual, their training experience, their weak points, and their response to training. I also want to mention that some of the lower thresholds for volume on this list are less than what I recommended in some of my training guides, and that is simply because it's very difficult to give an absolute cutoff point. Technically speaking, you will still be able to grow muscle with as little as 1 to 4 sets per week, but probably not as well as if you did more sets. It also depends on what the rest of your training program looks like, since many movements require synergistic action from other muscle groups that aren't the prime mover in the exercise. As for the higher thresholds, I don't really see any scenario where doing more than 20 sets per week for a given muscle group is productive for muscle growth. As I mentioned before, your sets need to be high quality. That means they need to cross the overload threshold. If you do more than 10 sets for one muscle group in any given workout, I question whether or not the later sets are close enough to your maximal performance to stimulate muscle growth. Think about it this way. If you're trying to get better at sprinting and you do 30 sets of sprints in one workout, are you really sprinting for the last 15 or 20 sets, or are you closer to a jogging pace? If you're jogging, then that certainly won't make you any better at sprinting. We refer to this concept as junk volume, and it's something that you want to make sure that you're avoiding during your training, regardless of if you're a sprinter or a bodybuilder. The next point to consider when writing your program is exercise selection. My recommendation is to make most of your exercises ones that have peak joint torque occurring when the muscle is most lengthened. This means that the muscle will be working the hardest when it is stretched. You should also incorporate at least some mid and shortened range work as well, so that you don't miss out on any potential growth that could be unique to those ranges. Pick exercises that allow you to feel the most tension, pump, local fatigue, and soreness in the muscles that you're trying to target. While pump and soreness may or may not be causative for growth, they are at the very least indications that the target muscle is being hit very well by the exercises that you chose. The next thing I want to talk about is exercise sequencing. Yes, the order in which you do your exercises matters. This is because muscle growth training is exhausting, and you may not be hitting things as hard later in your sessions as you were in the beginning. So if you only ever train a specific muscle at the end of your sessions, then you're probably leaving some gains on the table. Because of this, it is probably a good idea to have at least one session per week where you train a given muscle towards the beginning of a session, or at least not at the very end. For example, if you're running a push-pull leg split, on your first leg session of the week, you can train your quads first, and then on the second leg session of the week, you can train your hamstrings first. This way, you are fresh for each muscle at least one time per week. The next step in designing your program is determining load, rep range, and relative effort for each exercise. While this is highly contextual based on the movements that you're doing, general recommendations for hypertrophy are about 30 to 85% of your 1 rep max for load, less than 5 reps in reserve, aka RIR, for relative effort, and somewhere between 5 and 30 reps for rep range. I would recommend loading fatiguing compound movements like the squat and deadlift heavily in lower rep ranges, while keeping more reps in reserve than less fatiguing movements like lateral raises. I believe isolation movements like ab crunches are better performed with lighter loads and higher rep ranges, since they become difficult to execute properly when they are loaded too heavily. In my own training, I never do anything above 20 reps, but this is a personal preference rather than a requirement for hypertrophy training. Hypertrophy will remain the same anywhere in the 5 to 30 rep range, so long as you're training close enough to failure. Those numbers aren't exact cutoff points either, they're just points at which hypertrophy may diminish in a gradient fashion. The last thing you need to do before completing your program is determining how long the training block will be and how long your deload will be. Training blocks are usually 4 to 8 weeks in length, with my preference being 5.5 weeks of progressive training and then 4 days of deloading. Now that you know everything you need to know about writing a muscle growth training program, let's look at a sample program to see how you can lay things out in your training log. This is 1 week of training from a very basic and minimalistic program. It contains 4 training days per week and 3 rest days. The split is upper-lower, and the volume is low to moderate. This is how I like to set up my training logs, filling out weight used, reps achieved, and actual reps in reserve during each training session. There seem to be two schools of thought when it comes to progressing relative effort throughout the training block. Some people like to start out training with 2 to 3 reps in reserve at the beginning of the training block and then progress towards 0 reps in reserve with each passing week. Others like to keep 1 to 2 reps in reserve for most of their sets, only taking the last set of each exercise to all-out failure. I tend to do a mix of each in my own training, but I don't really think it matters as long as you train all the way to failure at some point so that you know what actual failure feels like. Otherwise, you will not be very good at gauging how close to failure you truly are. Spoiler alert, most people think they are closer to failure than they actually are, so keep that in mind when you're training. When progressing total workload, I would suggest taking one of two approaches. The first is to increase the amount of weight you are using by the smallest increment possible and to match the amount of reps you did in the previous week of training. The second is to use the same weight as the previous week, adding 1 rep to every set that you're capable of adding to. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is measuring progress. I think the option that has the best ease to accuracy ratio is to make sure that your performance is improving over time. If you're not improving in some capacity, then that means there is something wrong with your program and you probably aren't growing very much. I want to be clear about what I mean by performance. In the context of muscle growth training, this usually refers to things like your 5 and 10 rep maxes rather than your 1 rep max. There are things that can improve your 1 rep max that are not due to muscle growth, but we'll talk about that in another video. Another way you can measure progress is by measuring yourself or by getting someone else to do it for you. This is a good strategy, but I don't think it's entirely accurate. It is definitely good at detecting large changes in muscle size, but there are things that can acutely affect measurements like pumps, glycogen, water, and operator error, of course. But it's a good tool in the toolbox nonetheless. You can also take pictures of your physique to measure your progress. Just be sure that they are taken at the same time of day, in the same lighting, and without a pump. Lastly, you can use your body weight and various body composition tests to measure your muscle growth progress. This means using things like DEXA scans, MRIs, skin fold calipers, electrical impedance, and hydrostatic weighing. However, many of these aren't highly accessible to most people, so that's also something to consider. They also have varying degrees of accuracy, so sticking to more accessible methods is totally fine. Guys, if you watched this whole video, I just want to say thank you for your support. I really appreciate the views, likes, and engagement. I want to bring zero cost to consumer fitness and health information to as many people as possible. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and more importantly, I hope you learned something. Now get out there and make your own muscle growth training program, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you guys found this video useful. I will see you guys in the next video.